Welcome to the Exhaust Notes Podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Exhaust Notes Podcast. Guess what, everybody? This is season 4. Somehow, someway, we've made it to our senior year, and that's kind of apropos considering the guest that I've got beside me today, and that's one Professor Michael Sawyer. And Professor Sawyer recently wrote a great book on Lewis Hamilton, who is probably going to be the biggest source of entertainment, interest, intrigue, and all those words that your language arts teachers told you about when you were a writer in middle school. But before we get into that, Professor Sawyer, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and hope you're doing well, too. I really appreciate being able to stop by and talk to you.
Excellent. So let's just get into a little bit of who Professor Sawyer is. He's an author and professor of African American literature and culture, and the director of graduate studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh. He is a lifelong fan of Formula One and global culture, and he looks to merge them to offer a definitive account in the life and legacy of one of the greatest athletes of our era, in this case, Lewis Hamilton. And the book is actually called Sir Lewis. It's coming out on March 4th. And Professor Sawyer, could you remind me who's the publisher of the book as well?
Legacy Lit.
Legacy Lit. And it truly will be lit, because I was actually visiting some family this weekend in Los Angeles, and I just happened to stumble by a local Barnes & Noble, and there were already copious amounts of your book out in public, and I even saw a couple of people holding them in line. So early returns are good, at least from this one independent source, Professor.
Wow, that's exciting. I haven't seen it yet out and about, so I'm looking forward to it. So.
Yeah. And I think even where I'm based out of in Beaverton, we've got copies here. So I think that's the one thing I always kind of get nerded out about, is like, I know that you have those publishing dates, but now more and more, I don't know if that's a quest against Amazon or whatnot, but I even see even big box booksellers like Barnes & Noble start launching these books a little bit earlier than usual, which, hey, as a reader, I love nothing more. But
yeah, exactly. You know, it's like early Christmas time, right? It's like it comes 2 days
exactly.
early. So.
Yes. So let's just go ahead and get into the book. So could you talk to me a little bit about what was your perspective of Lewis Hamilton, or Sir Lewis Hamilton rather, in Formula One before writing the book? I know you mentioned that you were a lifelong fan, but could you dive a little bit into your origin story as a fan and consumer of Formula One?
Yeah, so to this point, before I worked in academia, I was in the Navy, so I was stationed in Naples, Italy in 1990. So I saw my first Formula One race in Italy, where Senna won the Italian Grand Prix that year. So I was kind of hooked from that point forward. As a kid, I grew up in Chicago. So as a kid, we played racing games, and I knew about Mario Andretti, but there was no clear separation between IndyCar racing and Formula One racing for me until I went to Italy and could see what was going on there. So I'd always been fascinated with Formula One for the longest time. And in the 1990s and obviously the early 2000s, it was, Schumacher and that whole, I was a huge Mika Hakkinen fan for all kinds of really good reasons. I really enjoyed watching him and just his approach to racing, just this kind of like, the distance and the clarity that I thought he brought to the sport. So that was exciting. And then when, you started kind of hearing about, if you were reading F1 magazine or kind of looking around, you started hearing about this kid that was coming up through Formula 3 and on his way to kind of Formula 1. So I was interested from that perspective. And obviously, as a person who, I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s, so Ali was always important to me, right? Like as an athlete. And then having lived through the arrival of kind of Tiger Woods into golf, where he changed the kind of way we understood golf. And it was even, and then Lewis is in many ways even more dramatic, because there had been Black golfers before, Calvin Peete, et cetera, people who'd been around, right? So it wasn't as if we'd never seen this before. But this was something that I knew was terribly complicated to get yourself into and really difficult to stay around. And then in that 2007 season, when he almost wins the championship, I think it was like, you couldn't imagine a kind of more compelling season for a rookie than that, right? It's almost as if just this unbelievable arrival that could not have predicted at all. The predictions were, all taking about half the season to kind of get used to the car, half the season to figure out how to be a proper teammate to Fernando Alonso, all these kinds of things. And obviously none of that was functioning in his mind. So I was fascinated from that point forward. And then as his career kind of evolved, you got to see just this kind of manifold interest, right? This person cares about all kinds of things, right? He cares about music, right? Which is, lots of people care about music. We all do, but cares about it in ways that are different, and had access to people who could help him understand that. Fashion's next, then it's, environmentalism, then it's social justice, and it's gender equality. It's, on and on and on, right? And he seems to be able to pay attention to all of them in equal measure while at the same time not sacrificing what he's doing in the sport. So that's really where the kind of point of fascination came for me. And the timing for the book, I thought, kind of post 2021, I thought it was a time to kind of really take stock of his career, because I would not have been surprised if he'd walked away from the sport at that point, right? I would not have been mad at him. I would have, really understood completely how that kind of disappointment can be devastating for anyone, but particularly for an athlete of his caliber. And then to kind of watch these last couple of years at Mercedes, to see the struggles that he's been having. And then all of a sudden this kind of Ferrari opportunity comes up. So I think the book gives us an opportunity to kind of pause for a moment, right? Like we're kind of doing now before this all starts. And right, to your point, becomes the point of everybody's interest in conversation. We can start over for a moment and then take stock of what we've seen for, this kind of career that has been almost impossible to imagine, and in many ways exceeds. It has set new standards for us to understand what it means to be, a perennial front runner in a sport, right? That where things change so
No, I was going to say,
rapidly.
he's got that envious nature of, I think anytime growing up as sports fans, we all have those aspirations to be athletes ourselves. And I think one of those pinnacle moments for us is if we have an entire era named after them.
Sure.
And Lewis has had that. And right now, I think we're probably year 3 in the Verstappen era. And I'm kind of in agreement with you, where I think it probably was given to us a little bit sooner in a little bit more controversial way than any of us would want.
Right.
But then at the same time, to look into what Lewis is doing, and, I'll skip around because I kind of have an outline of questions that I wanted to give to you.
Sure.
And you mentioned the Tiger Woods thing. I am from that Drive to Survive generation of Formula One fan. I'll be the first to admit that. Mm-hmm. So could you talk to me a little bit about his kind of arrival in the sport? Because if I didn't know any better, I would assume it would be very similar to Tiger Woods in that sense of, here is a person of color who's entering what the layman may have a perception of being a pretty vanilla sport aesthetically.
Absolutely.
And him blowing the doors off. And the other cross-sport comparison I would probably make, and granted I'm a little bit biased because I grew up in Missouri, so I'm a Chiefs fan, it almost seems a bit like Mahomes in his rookie year, where there was this buzz and there was this expectation around who this kid was, but he was still this great unknown. Was Lewis a little bit of A, a little bit of B, or some combination of both going into that rookie year of him?
Yeah, it's a combination of all that. I think there's a kind of dose, and this is way before my time, but it's a dose of Jackie Robinson in this too, right? Yeah. Where, the sport that had not had segregation as a fact of the matter, right? There was nothing that said you couldn't, but there were all kinds of reasons why you wouldn't, right? Why it wasn't possible, right? So I think that for me was, I'm like, watch this, I'm like, wow. And, so the resonance between the two dads becomes interesting, right? Like the kind of push that Mr. Woods, Earl Woods, had for his son.
Yes, sir.
And also what Anthony Hamilton pulls off from just, and even, you got to think about the Williams sisters and what their dad did. And then you think about in gymnastics with Simone Biles, her grandparents / parents, and pulling something out of nowhere.
Even LeVar from the Ball Brothers,
Absolutely.
right? Like every one of these stories has a proud papa protagonist that goes a long way, that shapes that cult of personality, because they have that unenviable task of being their harshest critic for their kid at the moment, because they know that no matter how harsh life could be for them, it's always going to get harsher. So they kind of have to be that bully, lack of a better term initially. But then to your point as well, when you see the coda of all these people as they hit that peak of their athleticism and their athleteness, the proud pop and the proud mom is always there, and there's always that tough love. But the most important aspect of that sentence is love, and you can kind of see that with Anthony Hamilton. So I'll use this as an opportunity to, if you could you tell us a little bit about Lewis's origins, his family, his upbringing, and how that shaped the driver we see on Sundays?
Yeah, so we'll get back in the Wayback Machine and talk about Anthony Hamilton first. And so, Anthony Hamilton is a person whose origin is in Grenada in the Caribbean. And so post-World War II, there was a large influx. The Windrush generation came to Great Britain to kind of fill in jobs. So he's part of that move, as his parents moved to Great Britain. So he gets there and is part of a generation of people who are new arrivals and figuring out their ways kind of culturally in England after World War II, where England is obviously, the world's a much different place kind of after World War II, right? So,
yes, sir.
Rather than what's interesting is rather than take up residence in a place like London, they end up in Stevenage, right? Which is, not London. And, at this time, mixed race relationships are not, as well received as they are now. So there's that moment, right, that happens for Anthony and Lewis's mom, right? So, they get divorced, but somehow, the families, and we all either have personally experienced or peripherally experienced families that break up and where the children become the thing between the parents, right? They seem to have been able to figure out how to maintain a positive relationship through parenting Lewis while at the same time managing Lewis, right? So Anthony Hamilton is both manager and father in ways that then are exactly resonant to what we're talking about with respect to Earl Woods and other people like that. And, probably 99 point, you can pick as many .9s as you want to. This doesn't work out, right? It's like, and LeVar Ball is exemplar. I mean, I remember watching LeVar Ball show up on ESPN. He'd be like, can this guy just stop, right? It's like, what position is he putting his kids in with this? And then it works, right? Somehow he figures, the whole thing he pulls it off, right? They get these huge contracts and they're productive athletes in the NBA, which I think is commendable. So, is that love that you have for a child, and also the point of wanting to push them even beyond what they think is possible. I think that there was this really complex relationship between Lewis and his dad, where Lewis was even seeing things that his dad probably didn't think were possible. And how you're doing that at age 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 when, it's all a big mystery is really, I think, really miraculous part of the story. So much of this book is about, there's a whole parenting and fatherhood part of this book that is part of the Formula One story, but I also think is instructive for thinking about just, if you have a kid who wants to be a really good math teacher, right? Like a math, what do you do to kind of support that, right? To push and pull, and when do you know when do you walk away, right? So I think that's also what's important, is when the professional relationship between Lewis and his dad comes to an end. And I don't like using the term breaking it up, because that's not really what happened. It's kind of, there's a point of separation, right, that had to occur, I think, for both of them to make their way, to evolve past that kind of father-child / manager relationship that's all too complicated, because the lines between those things had become so difficult to unpack. I think it was time for them to kind of move apart, and I think it's been positive for both of them, from what I can see, obviously, from the outside.
No, knock on wood. I mean, I think as you were waxing poetic so beautifully on that, that was the natural framework in my mind that came, which was, it's an evolution, right?
Yeah.
And there's always this kind of adage, and I think I'm the son of a mom and a dad, and I'm also fortunate enough to have a baby girl, and it's one of those things that one of the best pieces of advice my folks gave me is, your kid is always going to be your kid.
Right.
It's just, how do you evolve alongside that notion? And I think Anthony has also done a fantastic job, because this could have gone a myriad of different ways, but it's this measuredness that I see from Lewis that I'm assuming he must have kind of inherited from his dad, because if there's one thing I would use to kind of describe Lewis from a superpower perspective is, no matter how adverse the situation is that he finds himself under, and we'll use that flashpoint of 2021 as the primary example, there's still a measuredness about him that's wise beyond his years. And in spite of all the chaos and turbulent nature around him, he just always maintains that even blood pressure, or that even tone of voice. And you can sense a disappointment when things don't go their way, especially with what 2021 begat. But at the same time, that drive, pardon the bad pun and all, this is what separates the elite athletes and the sportsmen and sportswomen from Joe Schmo like you or I. And that's where I was wondering for you is, like, do you think what you know about Lewis and his upbringing, like, is this a example, or I don't even want to use the word symptom because that's got a negative connotation to it, but is this a result of his childhood? Because I just think the way I've always known Lewis as a newer Formula One fan is he's the sage old final boss. Like, he is extremely dominant. He's extremely hungry. He's cutthroat when he needs to be, but he's also doing it with not even a smile on his face, but just like a general, like, checking to see, are you okay? Because I am pretty damn good at this.
Yeah, Lewis is I think elegance is probably the term that we probably want to use, is a really elegant performer and human being, right, in lots of ways. And I think what you're saying about 2021 and that disastrous last race, the result of that, I guess, put us in position to say a couple of things. I think most importantly, because, any well-coached public figure can present a persona that we all be like, oh, it's a great person. And you see the person outside, it's like, wow, right? It's like, out when they're outside of the spotlight, or in a situation where they're really under pressure and they're gonna revert to what they really know, who that person really is. I think if that was probably, and I don't know this, but I would guess, was probably one of the most difficult moments Lewis Hamilton could possibly have experienced for like all kinds of reasons, right? When you think about that season, just the string of races he had to put together to get himself in position to be able to win that title, right? And then what had happened in the opening corners of that, even that race, right? To alive this kind of crash that would have ruined everything. And then to be up, 15, 7, whatever it is, 15 to 17 seconds, and have this happen, and then have someone alter the rules where you're just helpless to do anything about it, is the worst thing that can happen, right? Like, athletes learn very early on to deal with like bad calls from officials. This is not a bad call, right? This is altering the rules of the game. It's just bizarre, right? It'd be like if Steph Curry hit like a 3-pointer with a tenth of a second left, and the ref runs out and says, you know what, we changed the 3-point line. That was actually 2 points, so you lose you lose the game, right? You'd be like, what are you talking about, right? It's like, and that's the level of problem that we had in the situation. So I think when he gets out and walks over to Max Verstappen and congratulates him, and then goes to that podium ceremony and talks about the worthy champion that Max is, that has to come from like what happened in his upbringing, right? Being bigger than the moment in certain ways, being bigger than even the most negative moments. And I think that revealed him as a particular type of subject that's worth careful consideration. And I think I grew up watching Ali as a child, right? And I remember when my dad took me to watch him fight Larry Holmes on closed circuit television in like some movie theater, right? I cried for like 2 days after that fight, because for me, Ali was invincible. He was
untouchable.
He's a superhero. Literally, we had the comic book where he beat Superman, right, in a fight, right? And you would see him around Chicago, so it wasn't as if he were like some distant figure, right? You would see Ali around the city, and he's this kind of beautiful person. And then as you grow, you learn that he lost the best years because he cared about something deeply, right? And so it becomes really important. I think Lewis is in that same kind of conversation. And to this point, right, that has to come from, kind of the situation that his dad and his mom and his mother and stepmother, right, that entire combined family, whatever term you want to use for it, right, really, and his brother, right, and that small yet diverse kind of situation, figured out how to produce this kind of subject that has proven over and over again in different situations that he's able to perform elegantly, like where we started with this kind of portion of the conversation.
No, and I mean, elegance is probably one of those words that I would use to describe your prose in the book in terms of how far I've gone into it. But then also, it is a stark contrast. So I guess I'll use this opportunity to touch a little bit on that subject that you had mentioned about Max Verstappen, because I think it's a very jarring juxtaposition, because my limited knowledge of Formula One is it's a sport that's been characterized by dominant runs. And I haven't been able to get anything past, let's say, the back half of the Lewis run, and right now the totality of the Max run. But even looking at this sport just under the lens of those two runs, it feels like night and day, because with Lewis, there was an inevitability the same way that there is with Max on his good days. But to your point, you don't mind seeing elegance be the dominating characteristic of someone's performance. With Max, it's a little bit more cutthroat. And to your point around having that discussion where you've got these two protagonists who are essentially going to shape the modern era of Formula One as we know it today, it's really interesting to see, because I'll use the example that you cited in the intro of your book, right? There was a not nice term that Max had kind of utilized to describe his frustration with a particular moment. And thankfully you censored the word, because I couldn't figure out what that word was. But you also mentioned the point that Formula One did a lot to kind of scrub that from the public ether. And I can't think of any time other than the occasional Lewis kind of sandbagging, saying like, oh, I don't know if this car's good enough. It's never necessarily a criticality of anybody outside of the machinery or maybe himself. Could you talk to me a little bit more about that dynamic and what you see as the differences between the two?
Yeah, and I think, Max is in many ways, and I'm not using this pejoratively or reductively, he's a blunt instrument in certain ways, where Lewis is a very sharp razor. And I think that showed itself in Max's driving style, where, if you're trying to pass Max Verstappen on the outside, he's going to run you off the road, right? He's not going to try to figure out a different breaking point, he's going to force you to drive off or crash. Those are the two questions that you have kind of in front of you. And you know, that was the thing with Verstappen, is he matured, right? Because he was very young when he came into the sport as well. And his dad had been a driver, right? So he comes into the sport with a particular type of understanding of what it takes to be a good driver, or what that amounts to. And I think that's who Max Verstappen is. And I think in many ways, Lewis, and the way he performed during that period, during that era where Mercedes was very, very dominant, for people who were fans of his, I'm sure there are people who were like angry about it, were tired of seeing him win all the time in ways that, you know, whatever the case, you know, because we live in a world where negativity gets way more run than people doing things positively, right? You know, oh, I'm sick of this person winning. I just wish somebody else.
Squeaky wheel, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Squeaky wheel always gets the grease.
Always, right? It's, people said the same kind of things about Carl Lewis when Carl Lewis was like so profoundly consistent, right? That it was like, it made you forget that this is a very difficult, these are very difficult sports, right? You think about Carl Lewis's run in the long jump, right? That was like, you know, years and years, or even, you know, track and field sport, I kind of know best of anything. Like Edmund Moses went years without losing a race, right? It's like, you know, come on, when's it going to happen, right? But Max shows up as this kind of super talented driver who really doesn't seem to care about anything except driving, right? Which is cool, right? It's like, you know, that's who most Formula One drivers probably are to get to that point, right? It's like, you know, such a discipline, and you need such a point of focus. And I think that plays itself out. And I couldn't find, and, you know, I hope someone will help me find this. I remember distinctly, this is when Max Verstappen was first showing himself to be a person who could end up on a podium, right? I think it may have been Max's first podium. And he says to Lewis Hamilton when they're back, "Do you know who I am? Or do you know my name?" Right? Lewis is like, "Of course I do," right? There's only 20 of us out here, right? It's like not difficult.
Right, yeah.
So there's a perception that Lewis, and what I took from it is that Lewis had seemed even to other people in the sport to be so far above and in the distance that he wasn't even aware of who else was out there. They were just kind of empty, like empty signifiers, right? You'll hear people say the same thing about Michael Jordan, right? Because I remember listening to Allen Iverson talk about the first time he was on the court with Jordan. He says he could see like this guy's aura, right? Like walking toward him, but he didn't know what to do because, you know, your hero was out here with you. And so there's all kinds of ways to handle that. You can handle it like Allen Iverson did with kind of elegance, or you can
cross them up.
Yeah, you can cross them up, or you can be, you know, Anthony Mason and try to throw him into the third row of the stadium, right? It's like, and I think Max is on that other side of this equation, right? And it set up epic kind of challenges and epic events where you watch these races and it was like, you know, you were at the edge of your seat because you didn't know what was going to happen, because you know that Max was not going to give way in certain in places where most drivers would, and he was expecting that Lewis would back out, and Lewis had to get to the point where he was going to refuse to do that. And that's where I think, you know, the flashpoint happened, right? And then the Formula One world divides itself into the Max Verstappen camp and Lewis Hamilton camp at that point, right? And ne'er the twain shall meet. And so I think that's, you know, we'll see how that plays itself out this year, but I think that's about where we are, where the story ended last season, right? It was at that kind of point.
Yep. And I'll use that as a segue to kind of talk about the prancing horse in the room, if you will. Yeah. So for some of us that may be still new to the sport, I mean, I always work with the theory that there's always a first-time listener of the podcast. So what I wanted to do now is just kind of touch on Lewis the driver, if you will. So you mentioned a really cool point that I was hoping you would when we were having a chat earlier in the conversation around you were a big video game fan, or like you got into racing somewhat because of the video games. Could you define what Lewis's driving style is in a video game sense, where it's like if you were playing a video game and you selected Lewis Hamilton and you could see his attributes, what would be the things that would make him stand out to you? Or more importantly, stand out to a new person watching the sport that could say, oh yeah, this is my guy because he does X, Y, and Z so well.
Yeah, the thing that I think is most important about Lewis's driving is he seems to be able to find racing lines that other people don't see out there, right? And, you know, because, you know, Formula One racing, and this for people who are new to the sport, the way that you get around a raceway fast has nothing to do with the way you would ever drive a car, right? For lots of really good reasons, but it includes like swerving around and getting proper angles, right? So drivers spend time figuring out what is the racing line, right? So the racing line kind of defines itself on any course, and these fractions of a second that separate first place or world champion from someone who's in the middle of the pack are about shaving off just a little bit of that space, right? Breaking later than the other people will. So Lewis breaks later, which means that he's going faster for longer, and he picks different racing lines, and also his technical awareness of the car, right? So none of the engineers are ever going to drive the car, ever, right? It's not like even a normal, and even if they could, they can never get that kind of performance. So you have to have a type of physical intelligence that you can translate into words to describe to them what it is that you need or what's happening, right? And I think we saw this. Michael Schumacher was well known for this, right? To be a technically proficient kind of person who could describe what was going on with the car. Lewis has that gene, and he's fearless. I mean, any Formula One driver is fearless because it's not safe, right? The sport is relatively safe, but it's not safe, right? It's safer, but it's not safe in the way that we understand the term safety. So they're all at risk, and I think that what he does is calculate risk in ways that others cannot. And I think that's an attribute of most any, as far as I can tell, of all the drivers who've won world championships that separate them from everyone else who are great drivers out there. The greatest drivers are able to calculate and make real decisions about risk that other people don't seem to be able to make in the moment, right? As it's happening at 200 miles an hour to make those kinds of decisions, right? So, the obvious razor sharp reflexes, and at the end of the day, it's being able to absorb a tremendous amount of knowledge at the same time. And, Perfect. What do you do when it's wet? What do you do when it's windy? What do you do when when the wind shifts or the tires aren't working? How do you work through problems? So he's also a problem solver, right? Because we've seen in the long story of Lewis's career where there'll be moments where he'll be on the radio, be like, tires aren't working. This is what you were saying about where he's complaining on the radio sometimes. And then 5 laps later, they'll be like, Lewis Hamilton's purple in this sector. Lewis Hamilton just set past his time. It's like, how did he work through? Because they're like, he's just in the car working the problem out, and he can do it in that moment rather than having to stop and be like, talk to anybody and have some long, detailed conversation. He works it out. So I think that's those resilience and those kinds of things would be, if you were picking the attributes for a driver, you would probably design a person like Lewis Hamilton, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that I don't see the word prodigy thrown around a lot in that sport. And granted, I've only got to see Lewis as I wouldn't even say middle-aged man, probably wise old sensei would be the characteristic I would use to describe him. But it is exactly that, because to your point, anytime I see Lewis doing that, I can see that beautiful mind meme or that Zach Galifianakis in the Hangover meme where you can just see all the different equations in his mind, and he's just driving his car and being like, okay, it's equation this, it gets highlighted, and then boom, to your point, 10 laps later, he's got the fastest lap, he's head and shoulders above everybody else, and you're just kind of sitting there dumbfounded by his brilliance. So speaking of the brilliance, and this is where I think we want to kind of get into what current day Formula One is like. So obviously there was a big news that Lewis Hamilton has joined Ferrari. I was wondering if you could explain to our global audience what that is from an American sports perspective, because you've definitely established your bona fides, so to speak, as a sportsman and a sports authority. So how would you best describe Lewis to Ferrari in an American sports context? Or conversely, I know you said you were stationed in Italy for some of your service, and thank you for that. Like, is there a Serie A comparison you would want to make? Yeah,
I think, I'll work backwards from there. Italy is, when I got to Italy in 1990, Maradona was playing for Napoli at the time, right? And, I'm coming from the United States, and I kind of know about soccer because I kind of grew up where Pelé had come and was playing for the Cosmos, but you didn't get it till you actually got it. You could see like this, you go to a trattoria and there'd be a picture of Christ that was this big, then the next size up would be like the Pope, and then the whole wall was Maradona, right? It's like, who is that, right? This is an Argentinian guy who like plays for this team, right? It's like, and you're like, wow, like what is going on? And so you got to see just the Italian sports mentality, right? So the Italian sports fan, it invests itself in a type of romance, and nothing is more romantic to them than Ferrari, period, right? It is like, it traces its lineage back through the great design houses back to the Italian Renaissance, where, you know, the kind of art that gets produced, rolling art, right? The sound of it, the everything about it is what Italians love, right? So when the Tifosi of what the Ferrari fans are called, Ferrari wins a race in Maranello, they ring all the church bells, right? It's like, you know, this is the best thing that can possibly happen at this side of Christmas time, right? And so him being able to pull that off, and it's very, very difficult. So to think about, you know, it, and this is, you have to think about a different era of NBA basketball than we have now, right? Where you can assemble kind of super teams in certain kinds of ways, right? What this would have been, if we think about the Jordan era of the Bulls, was somehow, and I remember, because I'm from Chicago, right? So this was like really poignant for me, right? I remember there was talk about Michael Jordan is going to go to the Knicks, right? It's like, what? It's like, you know, how could that happen, right? Not any place, but, you know, we couldn't figure him being anywhere. But the notion of him being playing for the Knicks and then coming back to Chicago when all this kind of, you know, tension had been between those two teams, like the biggest arena and what, you know, the way they build Madison Square Garden, right? The kind of, you know, everything, right? Spike Lee, all of that, right? Everything that means. And we've seen that happen again and again, right? It feels a lot like what LeBron James moving around. It's happened so many times. It hit his loss on its edge, but it's like, you know, him showing up at the Lakers or something. When he shows up at the Lakers, it's like, whoa, right? The kind of storied franchise, right? And so it's at that level. And also to keep in mind the difficulty where there are only 20 seats in the sport, right? Period. And there are probably 6 of them that even the best driver could potentially win a world championship from, right? So you, like, the pieces that have to move in order for that to happen. And I feel terrible for Carlos Sainz, who lost his seat at Ferrari to make space for Lewis, right? Because Carlos is a person who has won Grand Prix and could learn to put together a season to win a world championship, and had a car that and a team that could produce that for him. For all that to come together at this moment, at the end of this person's storied career, is the biggest story in sports right now, as far as I can tell. And Americans, because of, you know, Lewis shows up at a time when, you know, communications technology, social media, the internet, the pandemic, and Netflix all happen where this person is all of a sudden in people's homes, and you're like, who is that, right? In ways that he'd been around since 2007. And, you know, Americans, you know, are not people who pay attention to a sport like Formula One. We pay attention to figures, right? And subjects. And so he creates this kind of interest for lots of really important reasons. And so that's the moment we're in now. And, you know, I'm encouraged by it, just with the results we've seen so far, but I'm also trying to be bigger than I was as a kid when Ali lost, and not have it be the kind of heartbreak if it doesn't all come together, right? Because in many ways he's already won. Just everything that had to happen to get to Ferrari now, and everything and the risk that he's taking as an athlete at an advanced age, where, you know this, right? The races between what you know about the sport and what you can do with what you know.
Yep.
Right. And there's this kind of moment in the middle where you kind of know as much and you can do as much. And if that lines up, then you have eras, right? Where this person is like unstoppable, right? Unhittable. The way like Pedro Martinez, and you know, he was, you know, unhittable, right? Just like everything, what he knew about pitching and what he could produce physically was right there. Lewis is at that point where he knows everything about the sport. And the question is whether he can physically, and the question of physicality also includes the car that he has to drive and the tactics from the team, whether those things can line up for this last 2 maybe 3 years for him to pull off this kind of impossible move. And that's what I think is exciting about it.
Yeah, I think completely. And it's one of those things as well where I've been racking my brain around, okay, how do I would explain this? Because I'm in a corporate setting right now, and Formula One, you can just see its popularity gain bigger and bigger each corresponding year. And it's one of those things that as I'm trying to explain to people, I just keep coming back to the perspective like you mentioned, and especially a native Chicagoan like yourself. It's like, if MJ's second three-peat was over and he had the opportunity to get a 7th at the Lakers, right, because it's those historical institutions. And this is something else that I wanted to kind of get your take on, because compare Lewis's legacy if he gets that final championship at Ferrari versus if he doesn't. Because I think for me, it's like, at this point, he's just playing for the icing on the cake.
Sure.
He's got the cake. He's got multiple cakes. But if he can do it in Ferrari, which is its own historic institute, which is its own set of neuroses, set of anxiety, and then they've also kind of gone through a dry streak, if you will, of not winning the constructors in a while. Now, there's a question as well of like, I'm of the opinion, I think Ferrari may have gotten rid of the wrong driver, because I think Carlos Sainz's superpowers his ability to adjust.
Sure.
And I'm really interested to see what that dynamic is between Lewis and Leclerc going into the season. But I think it is going to be very interesting to watch, because it truly is as big of a what-if moment as I can have sensed in Lewis's career.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, when he moved from McLaren to Mercedes, that was, it was time. McLaren couldn't figure the car out, and, there were problems, and he took a leap there. Some people were like, oh, this is going to work out. You just have to work these problems. But that worked, right? And I think the bloom was off the rose of that relationship at Mercedes, because for some reason they weren't listening to him, which seems crazy to me, right? It's like, why aren't you listening to this person who's telling you what's wrong with this car? Or he's telling you, back to what I was saying about his ability to translate these things, and people who had never driven the car are telling him he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's also a person who's won 7 world championships, right? He's like, why aren't you listening to me? So, yeah, I think, it's almost impossible. You think about when Tiger Woods won the Masters a few years ago, like out of nowhere, right? I can't remember what year was it, 2019 maybe?
I feel like 19.
Yeah,
Let's go with 19. And
something.
Listeners, you can correct us if you want.
Yeah,
that's
whatever.
Fine.
Yeah, they can correct us whenever that was. But I remember like texting my dad. I was like, wow. Because I remember the first time he won it, I'd watched it at my parents' house, and it was like this kind of euphoric moment. And to watch him be able to put that together again, right? And and I just was like, man, he should just walk away at this point, right? Just like at this moment, just like leave it right there. And then just have that be like this, to your point, right? This kind of icing on the top, the tippy top of this
It's
cake.
the Jordan shot at Utah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Right. And that, that picture is so fascinating. I love looking at that picture of Jordan, Utah, because I like looking at the people in the stands, right? This is one woman who has this look of just terror on her face, because she knows that this shot is going in, right? Just walk away, man. Just let it leave. Just leave like that, right? And so, yeah, it's it feels a lot like, these kind of moments when you see this with individual athletes. They're on teams, but these are very much individual athletes. So there's a kind of added layer of complexity, right? Where they have a teammate, but it's really them that have to produce at this level. So you're thinking about, the kind of disappointment of what happened in Usain Bolt's last time on the track, right? Where he ends up, laying on the track because he's injured. He lost the 100, the 4x100 didn't work out. It wasn't the way you wanted him to walk away, right? And we've seen that so many times. It's like, we just hope that this can be different. But also what I'm hoping is that we can think about everything that's happened and just be, it's like, I said to someone the other day, it's like being alive and being able to go to like the Globe Theater when Shakespeare's just producing plays, right? It's like, what's this one about? Here's about some guy in Denmark, and oh yeah, we'll go see it, right? You walk out of there and you just saw, right? It's like, this is the greatest play potentially that ever been produced. You just happen to be in the stands at the time, and like you're some person who was in Berkeley when Jimi Hendrix is there or something like that, right? It's like this meteoric kind of thing, right? You don't want to hear about it, you want to be there, right? So we're kind of there to kind of watch this happen, and I just want to be able to bring some scaffolding around it where it doesn't have to be that perfect thing, but even in these kind of imperfections, we can see just like the effort here. And I think Lewis, what we've seen in testing the last day, like really is ready, and the car seems to be ready. So I'm excited about it from that perspective.
No, knock on wood.
Yeah,
I hope we all get what we want. Yep. And so we are going to wrap up, but I would be remiss if I didn't do this. First of all, I want to thank Mirren Fader because she was able to give me a bit of credibility with you. So please, thank you, Mirren. And if you see her, Professor Sawyer, please give her my best. And lastly, Professor Sawyer, the book is Sir Lewis, comes out March 4th. Anything else you'd like us to end on before we pause for the episode with regards to Lewis Hamilton, your book, just the whole process in general?
No, I just want to thank Miriam as well. She really wrote an exciting book herself, right? That helps in basketball.
The Hakeem book and the Giannis book, both are fantastic.
Like epic books, and I really appreciate her support of this project. So I'm going to say that. But yeah, I mean, just, I just want people to enjoy. I hope people take a lot from the book. I hope there's enough in there for hardcore Formula One fans, and also for people coming to the sport who just want to learn more about this figure who I think is really someone we should pay attention to in ways that are not obvious in some senses, that are off the raceway. So I'm really excited about it. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm really excited about interacting with you over the course of the season, hearing what you think about what's going on. So I look forward to talking again.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll get back to you in a future episode.